final panel of this first day of the conference. And this is, we've now moved to experiences, effects, and implications, and we will hear 5 papers. And I believe that one of the recurring themes will be one of the main themes of the conference, identities, and including individual, collective, and also constructed identities. And just as a brief aside, I mean, these constructed identities through certain labels, such as alien, illegal, and undocumented, can have a profound effect, of course. And just on a personal note, since we're talking about experiences, when I received my green card, not only was it not green, but pink, but on the top of it, in bold letters, I had moved from alien to resident alien. So I was still an alien, but in residence. So more seriously, though, these labels, of course, pose obstacles for humans, and for because of it's easier to deny rights to those who have these labels, including human rights, and that will, in fact, be one of the issues that the first presentation will address: the intersection of globalization, corporate globalization, and human rights and corporate responsibility. And I think George Cheney will introduce the co-authored paper. Okay.
Let me briefly introduce Johanna Watzinger-Tharp that you just heard from. She's from the Departments of Linguistics and German, and is also a new Associate Dean of the College of Humanities and the incoming Director of International Studies. I'm just going to introduce for a moment and then turn this presentation over to my colleagues. A caveat at the outset: none of us are scholars of migration studies. In fact, this represents a venture into a new area for us, but a very, very interesting one, and we're very pleased to have this opportunity. In a sense, we're taking a lead from a couple of comments that were made this morning about globalization, and more specifically corporate globalization. When we talk about issues of migration at any level, academic, policy, or in popular discourse, we tend to focus on 2 sectors, those sectors being the public sector in terms of formal policy matters, and then NGOs or nonprofits that are dealing with issues faced by refugees, such as what Julie was talking about in Guatemala just a short time ago. And then we touch on the responsibilities of corporations. All 3 of us are scholars of communication. We also focus on organizational issues. And then more specifically, in this paper, we're looking at corporations. Our exploration is interdisciplinary, although we're very attuned to how issues are framed. So for us, the relationships between the symbolic and the material are very, very important. Or to quote Senator Obama recently, words matter. And so with that, I'd like to turn the floor over first to Erin Ortiz, who's a doctoral candidate here at the University of Utah in the Department of Communication, and then following her, Esther Agyeman-Budu from Kent State University, who's in the Department of Communication Studies there.
Thanks, George. Let me see here. Okay. Globalization brings an increasing proportion of the world's population into capitalist finance, labor, and consumer markets. This is evidenced by the impact of multinational corporations have on human rights-related practices and issues. Multinational corporations, which are increasingly being called transnational corporations now, are becoming the most powerful social entities on Earth. According to the Institute for Public Policy Research, 51 of the 100 most powerful economic entities in the world were corporations. That's kind of scary. So what we have noticed then is that a great deal of research has focused on the pros and cons of corporate mobility in terms of the firm's pursuit of cheap labor. However, relatively little has been said about the movement of labor or migration in general from the standpoint of corporate social responsibility, or CSR, and the ethical commentaries on the behaviors of multinationals. And so we are going to accomplish this by making very important connections between literatures on corporate globalization, migration, and human rights, and by identifying areas for further research. Esther and I will be presenting on each of these sections in 10.5 minutes, and by providing contexts and examples and kind of explicating the main arguments in each section of our paper. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing today. Okay, as you can see on this table, globalization is a very contested term. For the past 3 decades, the discourses of globalization has focused on corporate globalization. And this perspective of globalization, which you can see under the economics subset there, began crowding out other forms of globalization until the World Trade Organization protests in Seattle in 1999 began to change and shift discourses about globalization. So we're beginning to see that globalization is not univocal, centralized, nor easily predictable. These different meanings and dimensions of globalization, coming soon here, okay, indicate its tenuous and contingent nature, emphasized in Apatterai's work on the dimensions of a global cultural economy. This global cultural economy is characterized by various disjunctures between the economy, culture, and politics, and it provides the conditions under which current global flows, including migration, occur. What these disjunctures do, if we look at globalization in this way, is that it cautions us against generalizations regarding migration and human rights, and it directs us toward assessments that are culturally embedded. A perfect example of this would be our cultural constructions of the terms aliens and citizens, kind of what we talked about earlier this morning, and that the act of rhetorically naming individuals shows us how labels and categories can shape public opinion and policy. Therefore, these disjunctures help to explain the interconnections and the tensions between the material and rhetorical aspects of human labor. Other elements that we looked at include the tensions between voluntary and involuntary forms of migration. We noticed that various approaches to migration become somewhat complicated by the temporariness and permanence of migration. And so the line between forced and voluntary migration is very difficult to maintain and categorize. And this becomes even more complicated when we take into consideration the role of nation states in that they either prohibit or promote or inhibit international migration flows relating to competing for global labor. And a perfect example of this would be the European Union has established a blue card system, which is very similar to the US's green card, which would grant lawful permanent residence to migrants based on employment opportunities in order to attract highly skilled workers to Europe away from the United States and from Australia. Go team. Okay, so this graph here, or this figure, I should say, represents the blurry lines between voluntary and involuntary forms of migration. And I just wanted to provide another caveat. Our categorizations here are based on our survey of literature, and also they're reflective of emerging discussions regarding issues such as human trafficking and that sort of thing. And so as you can see, these various reasons, including war and ethnic strife, outsourcing and offshoring, are based on the push and pull factors based on the economic, political, social, and cultural dimensions of societies. So in order to move to an analysis of the potential role for corporate social responsibility in issues of labor migration and their framing in terms of human rights, I want to offer a very brief overview of the development of human rights regimes. Human rights regimes have been articulately been outlined by Stoll and Stoll along the concepts of different generations. And Stoll claim that the first generation of human rights stresses what governments and institutions should not do in relation to human rights. violations. And so these rights champion the protection of individual autonomy from, and freedom from arbitrary execution, from unreasonable detention, prohibition against torture, and that sort of thing. The second generation of human rights placed protection not on the individual from the state or government, but instead featured state intervention on behalf of silenced or repressed individuals or groups, with equality as the fundamental organizing term. And so these rights focused more on humane working conditions, such as the right to fair and equitable wages, the right for reasonable work hours, and that sort of thing, so on and so forth. The most recent development is under the kind of term the third generation, and this focuses on the rights of humankind, or our most collective humanity, taking an expressly transnational or global outlook. And so it underscores the positive responsibility to protect and create a sustainable and just social world by focusing on the global community rather than on specific nations and specific states or industrialized nations. And so this standpoint of the third generation places the burden of responsibility on multiple sectors to get involved with human rights, such as multinational corporations, non-governmental organizations, and multilateral organizations, that sort of thing. This table here shows the succession of key human rights treaties and conventions which were developed in response to demands for action. As you can see, the first generation of human rights was particularly prominent in the first conventions to suppress slave trade and slavery and concerning forced labor. Today, from the standpoint of the third generation of human rights, and according to the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, all members of society have responsibilities regarding the realization of human rights. And this is kind of where we take our paper. This is our basic assumption within our paper. And what Esther is going to do right now is talk about, in particular, how multinational corporations are implicated in their roles in international labor migration and CSR initiatives. So.
Thank you, Erin, and I'm very honored to be here today. I will finish the final part of this presentation. Okay, so we're going to look at the role of multinational corporations, also called TNCs, and international labor migration. The policies of multinational corporations affect migration flows at both ends. We have multinational corporations either being a guest receiver, where immigrants move to the location where you have the corporation, or they can also serve as a host receiver where immigrants would, I apologize, when they're the guest receiver, the international corporation would actually move to where cheap labor is, and we have that in terms of offshoring. And as host receivers would have immigrants actually move to the companies to work. And we've talked about that a lot throughout today. Next, we move on to the fact that multinational corporations have, as a result, gained enhanced power. Flourishing free trade networks, along with increased measure and acquisitions, have enhanced the power of multinational corporations significantly. Today, exports from more developed countries include not only final products for sale, but also products that have been partially produced offshore and then sent finally to the primary company and then, sold out. And the free movement of labor is one of the key issues facing international migration today. As Wainryb 2002 contends, the zeal with which the free movement of goods is pursued through the World Trade Organization, or the free movement of capital promoted by the International Monetary Fund, is contrasted by the hostility of most governments towards the movement of labor. And one question that we would all like to consider is, to what extent should multinational corporations, as receivers or hosts of immigrant labor, be responsible for maintaining certain labor standards, or at what level do we as a society or as a community decide what is their responsibility towards this particular group of people. Next, we'll move into the role of multinational corporations in labor, international labor migration. And we'll turn to Table 3 to see the multiple ways in which multinational corporations are themselves implicated in labor migration. As we can see, they are implicated through global interdependence, which we've talked about today. We've highlighted some key points, and in the interest of time, pay attention to those key points. They also have industry strategy and competition globally. We have ownership and governance, and finally, human resources and labor practices. And this is how multinational corporations themselves are implicated in this discussion. Next, we'll look at corporate social responsibility, multinational corporations, and labor migration. We recognize the rise of international interest in economic justice and human rights. The relationship between human rights and corporate social responsibility initiatives may be seen as part of a growing international interest in economic justice worldwide. Recent corporate scandals around the globe involving multinational corporations have led to pressure on corporations to maintain acceptable levels and standards to society. And an argument being made is that just philanthropy is not enough. Responsibility should go beyond just giving money for causes of just philanthropic issues. And according to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, they offer a definition for corporate social responsibility that we will share with you. Corporate social responsibility is businesses' commitment to contribute to sustainable economic development, working with employees, their families, the local community, and society at large to enhance the quality of life. And in this definition, the emphasis is on the quality of life. The quality of life extends beyond all prior definitions that have been offered before, and that is the reason why we specifically chose this definition to share with this group. Next, we'll go on and take a look at Table 4. Table 4 attempts to sketch the development of corporate social responsibility as a collection of ideas and practices that can be seen against a wider backdrop of business-society relationships over the past 130 years. Even though a lot of the debate on corporate social responsibility has been heated over the last 3 decades, corporate social responsibility has actually existed for over a century. And next, we're going to take a look at the UN Global Compact. This is a document that, as of 2006, has been signed by approximately 4,300 major corporations, labor, and civil organizations. This document includes categories of human rights, the environment, labor, and anti-corruption practices. While neither of these sections on human rights nor the one on labor address questions of human labor mobility directly, the 6 principles highlighted under these 2 categories are directly relevant to the discussion and the question of what responsibilities, if any, should multinational corporations have in confronting issues of human labor migration. And as we can see, Table 6 shows some key treaties established to guide the conduct of multinational corporations. And highlighted below, you can see that the United Nations Global Compact was one of them. And in the interest of time, I'll go straight forward to our conclusions, and we offer some practical recommendations. We need critically engaged but empirically sound scholarly inquiry into the policies of the business sector, the state, the nonprofit sectors with respect to migration. A step forward today has been offered in the terms of Migration Information Source, which is a grassroots project, which is an online journal. And according to a recent New York Times article, they had, I believe it's 140,000 unique visits each month in the past year alone. Next, we should delve into the rhetorical constructions of the terms responsibility and accountability as used in practice and policy. Noel 2005 challenged the use of the term responsibility because it tended to award business the power to set its terms of its own conduct. He proposed replacing it with the notion of accountability, which lays, and I quote, which lays bare the power relations which the seemingly benign language of responsibility and citizenship seek to deny or obscure. We also mentioned that we should consider a proposal for an immigration scorecard. And in the interest of time, I will move on to the final conclusion, which is the Global Compact of 1999 needs to be strengthened and further articulated as to make clear what certain responsibilities for migration patterns are upheld by both the private sector and the government. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Monisha Pasupathi from the University of Utah, who will present her paper entitled Collective Identity and Everyday Discrimination Among Bosnian Refugee Youth, and that paper is co-authored with Cecilia Wainryb, also from the University of Utah.
Okay. I'm going to hope I'm still up here. Yeah. So I want to begin by acknowledging my co-author who's sitting over there. I also want to perhaps meanly acknowledge the efforts of Amra and Arminka sitting back there, who did many of the interviews that I'll be talking about in this talk. We're here representing the Department of Psychology and also the Institute for Policy and International Affairs, which funded this work. But before I launch into the talk itself, I do want to say that at this point we're actually going to shift levels of analysis, because I'm here as a developmental psychologist, and what that means is that I'm interested in individuals and in how individuals experience the kinds of things we've been talking about thus far at the level of sociological, economic, political analysis. So I think keep that in mind as we shift. I think talking at different levels and being clear about those levels is an important thing for us to do if we're going to actually be informative to policymakers. All right, let me begin by just talking briefly about normative identity development. This is sort of where I live most of the time. Identity development is a lifelong process. You can see here everyone from toddlers to middle-aged adults, and I only left out the other endpoints of the lifespan because I couldn't find photos that I really liked. But identity development is considered to be a focal point of adolescence and early adulthood. Now, identity is a psychological good, and we've been talking sort of around identity today and about identity in various ways, but ultimately identity is a psychological concept, although one about which many scholars from many disciplines have written important things. So from my standpoint, identities are complicated. They involve a number of things, including an understanding of oneself and of others, a sense of your roles and your obligations within those roles, a sense of your commitments to belief systems and ideologies, a sense of yourself as extended across time and across space, perhaps especially a sense of yourself as grounded in a personal past and moving towards a personal future. In this way, identity helps to provide some shape and purpose to our lives. It's an important psychological good. A couple of the foundations for identity development, psychologically speaking, involve concepts like security, relationships to others, a sense of place, and some minimal kind of life goods. That is, it's hard to do identity when you're starving, to put it bluntly. And one important component of our identities is the way we think about our membership in different kinds of groups, ranging from the social cliques to which we might belong, our religious groups, national groups, and ethnic groups. Migration and collective identities are relevant broadly, and we've heard about that in several speakers' comments today, because migration entails taking on challenges involved in being a member of new collectives, of new groups, and in negotiating what that means for individual identity. The way migrants resolve those issues matters. It matters for their own individual well-being, and there's an enormous amount of data on that in psychology, which I'm not really going to talk about. It also matters for the dynamics between different groups within our societies. That is, whether migrants come to think of themselves as also being American, as endorsing a constitutional patriotism, if you will, matters. Now, in this context, there's an awful lot of psychological work that looks at the consequences of collective identities, of identification with a particular group, and I believe the talk after me is going to touch on those issues, and I'm going to sort of leave them alone. What we understand a little bit less well, I think, is how people come to endorse those identities, and a related problem, which is that it hasn't escaped most of our notice that most of us belong to many different groups. And thus, the issues in developing collective identity aren't simply about developing a sense of oneself as a member of a particular group, but about also negotiating memberships in different groups, sometimes when those groups are at odds with one another. And I'm going to talk about just such a case. Now, recent work in developmental psychology suggests that when people are able to hold affiliations with many groups, but to kind of come to terms with those conflicts in some way, they do better psychologically. They do better at immigration, at adaptation to a new culture. So we wanted to look at a kind of experience that's very important, we think, for forming collective identity and for negotiating precisely that kind of conflict. That kind of experience is everyday discrimination. Now, this is a sign from a time in which a discrimination of the legal sort was very prevalent in American society. And we don't mean discrimination in the legal sense here. What we mean are the everyday experiences that call to our attention the groups to whom we are belonging, whether by our own endorsement or by the sort of acts of others, and the way those groups are valued. That is, we're talking about the experiences that I and people who look like me had after 9/11 in this country, going through airport security. This wasn't illegal discrimination, but it sure pointed out to me that I look Middle Eastern, which I happen not to be. And I'll come back to that as well. Now, for refugees, the experiences related to collective identity are deeply problematized. Remember that I talked about what you need to form identity in a more or less smooth way. Those things are all profoundly disrupted by migration in general, and especially by the circumstances of refugees. That is, refugees are robbed of secure childhoods. They may lose families. They are exposed to violence and trauma. These are images from CNN from the Balkan Wars. Identity linked to place is also profoundly disrupted. When this is your hometown, you've been robbed of something. Identity is existentially threatened, even in flight. And I like, this is Sebastião Zelgado's work in the lower corner, and I particularly like this picture because the participants in the study that I want to talk about today were probably roughly that age when they were fleeing the Balkans. Even after refugees find a safe location, that is, they're out of immediate physical danger, this is the Brandenburger Tor in Berlin. Germany was a place that took many refugees from the Balkan Wars. Even then, that threatened identity doesn't become irrelevant because refugees are repeatedly required to conceive of themselves and to present themselves in terms of a single group identity in order to be protected. The very reasons that justify asylum have to do with persecution based on group identities. So you have to define yourself in quite singular terms in order to have asylum. Now, at some point, many refugees relocate. In the case of the Bosnian population as a whole, the Bosnian diaspora population, many people returned to Bosnia-Herzegovina at the close of the war. Many people went elsewhere. One figure I saw said about 130,000 resettled in the United States, roughly 6,000. I'm looking at McLean Stiojaja because he might know more precisely, but roughly 6,000 in Salt Lake City, I think, originally. Now, once you're in a new country, you have a very particular identity dilemma as refugees that is, I think, distinct from other migrant groups. your group's history of threat and persecution imbues that identity with a kind of value that renders membership precious. That is, refugees may have an especially marked desire to retain their cultural identity even in diaspora. It's something that almost got lost. But successful adaptation to the new country doesn't necessarily accommodate that sort of subtlety. And new countries sort of have, I think in the words of our speaker earlier, a kind of fierce hospitality at best, in the sense that they're not too concerned with whether your prior culture is very precious. So we wanted to look at experiences of everyday discrimination in a group of Bosnian refugee youth in Salt Lake City. And we asked participants to tell us 3 stories about experiences with everyday discrimination. One in which they singled out, or one in which they were singled out or otherwise felt discriminated against as a Bosnian. One in which they singled out someone else. They were the perpetrators of discriminatory behavior towards someone else. And one experience of being discriminated against, but in a positive way. And what I want to do is, I want to first share with you some of the victim stories, because I think they highlight that conflict between becoming American and retaining something of being Bosnian. So one participant talked about, well, yeah, you know, there were these girls in class, and they were saying, oh, it's weird, she's from a different country, she doesn't understand. They were talking about how she couldn't communicate with them, and her parents don't drive, they don't have a nice car. So the impossibility of fitting in. Another participant, one of the things, you know, they would ask me to teach them bad words, and I thought it was okay, but then I thought I wouldn't get in trouble, and later they'd get caught, and the teacher would be upset, and they'd blame me, and I actually got 2 detentions because of that. And this one is kind of lengthy, but it boils down to the kids sitting behind our participant saying, you know, he stinks. And I like this one because he's sort of, you know, what the hell is he talking about? Now, these experiences are mundane. They're everyday. But I want to highlight the identity dilemmas that are posed by the content of these experiences. You're being told you're incompetent at fitting in. People are only going to talk to you if it serves their own entertainment. They don't care about you. You're physically repulsive. Let's see, I'm missing one. Oh, I'm missing one. In one case, you're actually depicted as a threat to society. These experiences are taking place in precisely the period of time in which these participants need to develop a sense of themselves, and they're taking place in daily interactions in school. This is your life. This is the society in which you're trying to make a life. And what they do is they devalue your identity as a Bosnian, and they juxtapose it with an unattainable Americanness. Now, we also asked about perpetration, and I'm going to go very quickly and just make the point that our participants also engaged in the perpetration of discriminatory behavior, and when they did so, it was often as a result of becoming American within a particular context. So, for example, in this case, discrimination against the assumption that somebody Latino is also a gang member, taking on the prejudices of the majority culture. Now, in closing, I want to make 2 points. I've focused in this very brief set of remarks on what happens to participants and the identity dilemma it poses. Well, our participants are not passive receptacles for their experiences. They also make sense of those experiences. They try to decide what they mean. And in some of the narratives, you can see people taking issue with the implications of what's happening to them. And so in this project, one of our major focuses in the next months is going to be to look more at how people make sense of those events in addition to just what's happening. Now, the second point that I want to make about this is that the developmental status of our participants is important here. There's other work looking at Bosnian refugees in Australia, but looking at adults. And adults are upset. They experience similar things. They have difficulties fitting in and adapting, but they have a much better developed sense of their own value as people in the past. I don't want to say that the consequences are worse, but they are different. That is, you can be very upset about what you've lost without, but that's a different thing than having difficulty developing something in the first place. And last, I want to return briefly to the issue of rights. This is clearly not legislatable behavior. This is not the kind of behavior where we're going to pass laws and address this kind of behavior, and it's not going to go away either. And I want to leave you, all of our participants said this behavior was wrong. It was wrong when they did it, and it was wrong when it happened to them. And I want to leave you with the one quote, which I think is the everyday person's version of Anthony Appiah's work and other related work in philosophy, in response to evaluating an event where he'd been discriminated against positively, right? So it was a positive discrimination. One of our participants says, well, it depends, you know, I guess it's not good, he ends, because each person is themselves individually. They have their own brain and mind and thinkings and feelings. And I think this is such a nice way to think about what we might want to inculcate in our educational systems, because this is, again, not legislatable, but this is, I think, where we need to think. We need to think about how to help people think about one another in these ways. I'm going to stop.
We will next hear from Ben Peterson, also from the University of Utah, on distinctions in national identity and the immigration problem, nationalism, construal of identity, and emotional prejudice towards immigrants.
Thank you. Problems here. Sorry, just a second. Guess my link wasn't working. Yay, fun. All right. I did do it earlier, so. Okay. All right. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk and share some of my ideas. And like Monisha said, I'm going to continue the theme on the kind of psychological aspects of identity, but this time I'm going to concentrate more on the sort of the receiving end of immigration phenomenon. So, in other words, how are immigrants received and treated by those who are residing in the destination country, and the role of the psychological experience and interpretation of identity on the part of those residents. So, while strong national identity and loyalty to the country often promotes negative reactions to immigrant groups, I want to show that this is not necessarily always the case. By making important distinctions in national identity, it's possible to show that a certain subgroup of national loyalists, namely those who construe the national group in a strict and exclusive way in order to promote beliefs in the superiority and dominance of the group, are responsible for a disproportionate amount of this anti-immigrant sentiment that we see. And so as my title suggests, whether one considers the immigration to be a problem or not is a point of interpretation that can be influenced greatly by how identity is psychologically constructed. So I'm just briefly going to lay out my rationale over the next few slides, and then discuss some data in several samples, including analysis of a large-scale international social survey, as well as some research that we've conducted here at the University of Utah that provides some initial support for integrating some previous researched elements into a single model of vulnerability and defense in national identity and identity in general. So basically the United States is, as we've kind of discussed, so on we will continue to discuss, has long had a relatively ambivalent relationship with immigration. So on the one hand, we're a nation of immigrants, with the vast majority of us tracing our roots back to immigrant settlers at some point in the recent past. And on the other hand, we also have more or less developed a certain idea of America and what it means, and allowing too many outsiders in may start to change what it means for some of us to be American. Now, some nationals, some citizens can deal with this relatively easily, appreciating the diversity that immigration brings and still feeling kind of secure in their love and their pride for being American. But on the other hand, others may be more threatened by the idea of the changing face of the United States, and they may come to believe that a growing population of immigrants challenges their way of life and sort of disrupts the elements of what they think make the country great. Now, you see some of the equations of immigration with invasion and the needs to be defended against. Now, some take it even a little bit further than that, and going further in their defense of what they think the country should be. So we see the people that go down to the border and they think they need to defend against the immigration problem, the Minutemen Project, various groups like that. So what I want to show is it's entirely possible, however, for both of these groups, both people who might be accepting of and people who might reject diversity, to both have a great love for and pride for their country, and for this identity be an important part of who they are. But in order to tease apart these two reactions, it's necessary to make some distinctions in national identity, pride, and loyalty. And so in this talk, I just want to make a few points of argument here. And the first one is that national identity is not, along with the pride and loyalty that goes with it, is not necessarily a unitary construct. And so it can be constructed and interpreted in different ways by different people, all within the same national group. So we can find a lot of diversity within the group of how we interpret what national identity is. And then certain modes of constructing identity can make it more defensive and vulnerable to perceived threat. And so I'm going to discuss a few elements in the following that relate to such fragile and defensive construction of identity. And then finally, defensive national identities tend to promote anti-immigrant sentiment, affect immigrant groups in negative ways, and can unduly influence the immigration policy debate. So just quickly, a few of the important elements that I'm going to talk about. First of all, and Monisha mentioned this in hers in relation to identity of groups who are immigrating into the United States, but a strict, exclusive, and simplistic interpretation of the national group and one's own identity is an important factor that can relate to defensiveness and anti-immigrant sentiment. And this is discussed by various, in social psychology by Marilyn Brewer and various other researchers, and by Amartya Sen in his book, a recent book. And so basically, just a little pictorial description of this. I don't know if that shows up well there. But to the extent that I can see my important groups converging on one small and exclusive group of people who also share all or most of my important memberships, this identity can be considered simplistic, kind of singular, unitary, and the boundaries are defined in a strict manner at the junction of the multiple groups that come together. And that's the figure on the right there. And on the other hand, or for example, so in this case here with the figure on the right, I would consider myself not just American, but I would consider myself a white male Christian American, and that's how I define myself. And anybody that sort of deviates from that is considered more of an out-group member than an in-group member. You can throw in a lot of different other groups there. I mean, we have a lot of different groups that we base our identity on, but to restrict it in that way, it leaves a lot of people out, and it leaves a lot of people as out-groups and possible threats. Now, on the other hand, if you look to the figure on the left there, it takes a little more effort to construct an identity that's inclusive of all members, of all groups that I may belong to, without making distinctions or drawing lines. Now, this figure on the left, you can see I'm not only I'm American, and that includes anybody who else is American, regardless of whether they're Christian, their ethnicity, their gender, their ethnic background, whatnot. So this is a more inclusive and more representative of a common humanity construct that we hear about. But it's infinitely easier to draw the lines in the sand and associate others who are not necessarily like myself outside of my group with others who are outside of my group. So this creates a rather small in-group, like I said, and it creates a lot of people who don't fall within that group that could be potential threats to that identity. So moving on, so that's the first one. The second one that I'm going to talk about is beliefs in the superiority and dominance of the national group as well. And this is well represented by a common distinction in national identity between nationalism and patriotism. And so both of these constructs involve a national pride, loyalty, and strong identification with the national group as an important part of the self-concept. But while a nationalism also incorporates beliefs and goals involving superiority, dominance, entitlement, and competition with other groups, a more healthy patriotism involves somewhat more of a compassionate love for the country and attachment to the national group, a recognition of its faults, a willingness to accept those, and a willingness to fight for and sacrifice for to improve the in-group. So more group-centered goals versus the more self-centered goals of a nationalist. And then finally, the final element, which as I'll show, kind of flows from the first two, is a perceived threat from other groups that are outside and that are perceived as different from what my definition of the group might be. So this can take on many forms, and a lot of different areas talk about it different ways in terms of a threat to the group in general, or I'm going to focus more on how the person actually perceives a threat to themselves on a personal level, and how that affects their attitudes and their emotions and their behaviors. So just mapping the elements that I'm talking about here. These elements are expected to interact dynamically. A strict and exclusive definition and an inflated opinion of the group's superiority reciprocally influence one another, and these leave the individual or the group more vulnerable to threats to the identity as it's constructed. So immigrants can be seen as especially threatening for some in that they may be perceived as both competing with citizens, for example, for jobs and government resources, or as potentially contaminating this exclusive and pure definition of the country on which this superiority may be based. So both should encourage strong emotional reactions and possibly lead to these defensive attitudes, behaviors, and policy preferences that tend to generally characterize any immigrant sentiment. So I'm going to move on. I want to fly through some research here, but basically just have a few large samples that we've collected, and one of them is a large international survey that I just analyzed in terms of the United States respondents there, to try to map out these elements and see how these work together in the relationships that we're proposing here, and how they all kind of relate together and promote anti-immigrant sentiment. So I have the International Social Survey in 2003, a sample of 1,216 people. Assesses nationalism, patriotism, a certain definition of the identity, national identity, and then anti-immigrant sentiment. And then we have an online study that we assessed similar constructs as well as perceived threat, and then a final sample that assessed certain other similar constructs, as well as we did some experimental manipulations with those groups as well, including an uncertainty threat to see how that influences their attitudes as well. So let me fly through this quick. First of all, this is just the sort of phenomenon of the misconception that a unitary national identity is related to unitary national loyalty and identity is related to anti-immigrant sentiment. And as you see, if we just look at national identity by itself without making any distinctions in it, it does show a consistent but small significant relationship with anti-immigrant sentiment, which is defined. I kind of lumped them together, the various elements together for the purposes of the presentation here, but you look at attitudes, a certain level of comfort with people, immigrant groups, and then more importantly, policy support, such as things like building a security wall or immediately deporting all illegal immigrants. So these things are measured in all the samples. So we start with the nationalism identity definitions. This is just kind of an idea of what these self-report scales that we do, that we assess, kind of what they're getting at. Nationalism, the world would be a better place if more countries were like the United States. Versus patriotism, that and there's anywhere from 4 to 12 elements or more that kind of get around this common theme of superiority and dominance, and people do endorse these. I mean, averages are lower obviously than patriotism, but and they tend to be highly correlated. But then patriotism is more just the benign love of the country. I'm proud to be American. I have a great love of the country. And then two ways of assessing the exclusive identity definitions. So in the large-scale social survey, they talk about strict qualifications for what it means to be American. So importance of various things like being born in the United States, having citizenship, speaking English, and the same religion, et cetera. And then in our sample, we assessed another construct which is called social identity complexity, which is based on some work by Marilyn Brewer. And it looks at, in this case, it's prototype similarity. So I'm given 5 groups, and I'm supposed to compare the prototype, what the prototypical member of these groups are. In this case, it was nationality, religion, ethnicity, gender, and sexual orientation. So I'm making comparisons between all the different the pairs of these groups, and I'm rating how similar I think the prototype of each of these groups is. And the higher the more I rate these as similar, the more my definition of my social identity as how my groups connect together is simplistic. All right, so let's move just some data. So this is just the parts of the model that I mapped out before. As you see, putting nationalism in strict identity definition assessed in two different ways, both in the large-scale social sample and in our sample here. They both relate together. Nationalism and the strict interpretation of the identity both relate to each other, and they both independently predict anti-immigrant sentiment as well. So then moving on to perceived threat, which we assessed in the Utah sample here. So how personally threatened do you feel as a result of illegal immigration? And then putting this into the model as well. In the first sample there, this was a sample that didn't have the complexity or the strict definition of the identity, so it just showed the mediational effect of perceived threat, that it's accounting for a lot of the variance in the nationalism and anti-immigration sentiment. And then in the second one, there's the same sample from the last slide, but it includes the threat in there, and it shows how perceived threat mediates the relationship between both of those identity construction constructs, the defensive and fragile identity constructs, mediates both of them, still remains a solid predictor of anti-immigrant sentiment while also taking away some of the explanatory power of those identity distinctions. Okay. Then finally, the last part I want to talk about here, we also want to look at the effective situational and contextual threat on these processes. And so what we did was, in one of our samples, a subsample of our last sample, we did a personal uncertainty manipulation where we asked, half of the people filled out talked about a personal dilemma that was kind of unresolved, and they wrote about this for about 15 minutes. So it kind of brought about a personal uncertainty there, and the other half wrote about a friend's dilemma, so it wasn't really self-involved, so it didn't create as much uncertainty. And what we wanted to see was if this would create, if a context such as what happened in this country after 9/11, if anecdotally this created more nationalism and more anti-immigrant sentiment in the United States, does this create more nationalists and just pick a person that's not a nationalist a nationalist? Well, we didn't find that. What we found was that it made the nationalists more strongly anti-immigrant than what they were before. So basically, people coming into the situation that were already threatened and had negative attitudes towards immigrants were more so. And in the threat condition, it was more than twice as strong of a predictor. So then finally, we looked at the International Social Survey again, because there was, in 1995, they had the similar constructs of nationalism and anti-immigrant sentiment that they measured in 2003, and we wanted to see a similar thing. Okay, is nationalism increasing? Is anti-immigrant sentiment increasing? Again, no. No differences in mean values, but the predictive value of nationalism on anti-immigrant sentiment increases. So the contextual threat in the United States is making these nationalists who are already anti-immigrant, it's causing them to be more vocal and more outspoken about immigration. So finally, summing up, basically, some closing comments here. So the model presented here really seems to help account for national loyalty's relationship with anti-immigrant sentiment by examining important distinctions in how national identity can be defined and constructed, and how these fragile elements of collective identity can leave it vulnerable to threat from other groups, and situational and contextual factors, eliciting strong anti-immigrant sentiment, including attitudes, policy support, and potentially defensive behavior, like the people who go on the border and defend it. In summary, immigration is a difficult issue for receiving countries that tends to arouse strong opinions and emotions from many citizens, but we need to recognize that it's not a unitary sense of national loyalty that's promoting this. We don't need to necessarily discourage a love for and loyalty to the nation out of fear that it's inevitably going to lead to hate, hostility, and restriction. We do need to hopefully find a way to promote a more healthy patriotic attachment to the country and our citizens, and hopefully circumvent the potential influence of those with a more nationalistic loyalty based on superiority, dominance, and an exclusive and singular view of what it means to be an American. If successful, this would go a long way to easing the prejudice and discrimination that Monisha talked about that immigrants to our country too often experience. So that's all I have to say. I just wanted to close by putting a couple of quotes up from Amartya Sen and Maurizio Viololi about identity and nationalism. So I don't really have time to read them, but I'll let you look at them while I leave. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Matt Sanderson, who will present work co-authored with Jeff Cantor, both from the Department of Sociology at the University of Utah, entitled International Migration and Human Development, cross-national analysis of developing countries.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here today to be able to present some of my research. I'm a doctoral candidate in the Department of Sociology, but I'm sort of in the transition phase out of graduate school because I've accepted a position that I'll start this fall, so call me what you want, I suppose. I think that we need to, this presentation is going to ask you to take a step back and look at the global level. Okay, so I'm a comparative international sociologist or a macro comparative sociologist, and I'm going to ask you to think more broadly than the level of the individual or the census tract, as we've seen. So this is going to be, in some sense, maybe an extreme thing for some of you, but just bear with me as I go through it. So I look at migration as an explanatory factor. So I look at migration as a factor that can explain variation cross-nationally. And here we're looking at human development levels as the outcome. So I'm just going to, I'll go through the paper as you can read the tables and stuff like that and go through it at your leisure. But I'll just go through the paper. I'll talk about my research question, the analytical strategy, the findings, and then just mention a few brief implications of the paper itself. So just a little bit of background. Migration is globalizing. There is a more diverse mix today of sending and receiving countries than at any other time, probably in the history of the world itself, but certainly since 1970. We've seen an increase in south-to-south movements, which are approximately about half of all migrant flows move between less developed countries. And that's going to be the focus today, is what are the impacts of international migration on human development in developing countries or less developed countries. And so these sorts of movements between less developed countries have raised new and very important questions about what are the impacts of migration on development, or how can migration promote development, or what are the effects of migration for development. And I'm going to ask, the data are the data, and so we really, in some sense, we have to get beyond little disputes about data and just sort of ask, what can we learn from the data cross-nationally? And so that's my purpose today. So our question, I should probably acknowledge my collaborator, but don't hold him responsible, but it is Jeff Kenter in the Department of Sociology. Our question is very simple, actually, but it is one that hasn't been asked or doesn't have a sufficient answer, and that is, how does international migration affect human development levels in receiving countries? And here we're restricting the scope to less developed countries. And we focus on the Human Development Index, which takes from Amartya Sen the idea that we shouldn't just be focused on economic development or rising per capita income levels, but a broader understanding of development in terms of per capita income, certainly, but also longevity and the right or the ability to obtain knowledge, those sorts of things. It's a broader understanding of development that I'm analyzing here today. So previous studies, especially previous cross-national studies of development outcomes, have excluded international migration as an explanation. International migration generally doesn't figure into the picture in cross-national studies of development. And so one of the purposes of this paper is to fill in that gap and ask the question, what is the effect of international migration? And we've previous research, where to the extent that it does focus on migration, looks at the effects of migration on migrant sending countries largely. And this literature is often framed in terms of, as we've heard throughout the day, what are the effects of remittances on development in sending countries? But I'm asking a different question, that is, what are the effects of migrant inflows on development in receiving countries, countries that receive migrants? And a lot of the previous evidence that we have is derived from case studies of particular countries, of particular places within countries, and to the extent that we have empirical evidence, it's derived from case studies. But also, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence. Well, migration should do this, migration should do that. We tell stories about what migration should look like, but we don't have the broad global picture yet of what migration is actually, how migration is experienced on the ground cross-nationally and over time. And so there's a need for this, and no less than Alejandro Portes himself has called for this sort of research, and it's worth quoting at some length, actually. He says, what we have today is mostly an amorphous mass of data on immigration to different countries and a series of concepts whose scope seldom exceeds those of a particular nation state. Needed are explicitly comparative projects that focus on research topic at a higher level of abstraction than those guiding policy concerns and that employ a common cross-national methodology. So, never one to shy away as a doctoral student. I took him up on his challenge and came up with this paper, actually, several papers, actually. But this need is also expressed by people, by non-academics as well. This is Kofi Annan in the Migration and Development report that came out in 2006. Each of us holds a piece of the migration puzzle, but none of us has put together the whole picture. It is time to start putting it together. So our study takes the broader view. We attempt to explain variation in human development levels across countries and over time. We incorporate migration as an explanation, whereas previous studies have not. We analyze a broader measure of development, not just per capita income levels, but human development. And this is in our attempt to actually assemble a more global picture. So a little bit about how the relationship between demography and development itself. Population change actually population composition influences development. This is widely known, and there are three forms of population change: fertility, mortality, and migration. The vast majority of research looks at the effects of fertility and mortality on development levels. Migration is relatively ignored. And this sort of relationship between population and development is usually summarized in terms of the demographic transition. It argues that economic development should ultimately, over time, lower mortality rates. There should be fewer people dying. As a result, because there are fewer people dying, there is less reason to have so many children, so fertility rates should fall, then population growth should slow down, and development should proceed. This is the idea that has been propagated for many years now, and it's summarized in the demographic transition. Development and demography are sort of, over time, will sort of come up with this, this very mutually beneficial process. But it turns out that development itself is not a good explanation of variation in the timing of the demographic transition itself. So you can't, the transition actually occurs, the transition from very high mortality and fertility rates to lower mortality and fertility rates actually occurs at a very wide array of levels of economic development. Okay, that transition's taken place at a lot of different levels. So this has stimulated the search for alternative answers for why countries round the hump. It looks like an inverted U. Why countries are able to round the demographic or make the demographic transition. And migration, I'm offering, is perhaps, based on the data, perhaps one of those factors that has been neglected but is an important explanation of human development levels in less developed countries. It has been called the X factor. It may be a relatively small proportion of the officially enumerated population, right? So it may be expected that it doesn't matter, but there's 2 points that need to be made here. The first is that it's likely there is significant undercount in census, right? So it's likely that the census formally or doesn't elaborate upon the entire population itself of migrants. And its effects may be felt throughout social structures. So its effects may not be limited to enclaves of migrants themselves. So migration is argued to have a positive effect on development. I mean, when we look at it in terms of countries or particular places, migration, usually people believe that migration has a positive effect on economic development, and I've actually found that in another paper. And this holds for both developed countries and less developed countries. It does look like migrants promote economic development. The question is, the problem is that economic development is separate from the idea of human development. It's one component of human development. It's a factor that goes into human development. So in less developed countries, migration may actually be detrimental to human development for a whole host of reasons. It represents a human influx, as Smith talks about, but it also might further fuel population growth that impedes the demographic transition. There is evidence that migrants have higher fertility rates. Those fertility rates obviously are going to slow demographic transitions. It might place additional pressures on already strained health infrastructures and education infrastructures in these places. We need to remember that in less developed countries, the state is not nearly as strong as it is in developed countries. So it's important that we think differently about migration into places like the U.S. or the EU from migration into Tanzania, Botswana, Ecuador, so on and so forth. The state is in some sense, very limited in these places. There's also evidence that migrants can facilitate the spread of communicable diseases, including HIV/AIDS, and that, of course, will slow down the demographic transition as well. And there's talk of cities as unhealthy islands now in less developed countries rather than islands of privilege as they used to be, and a new urban health penalty is emerging in these places as well, as associated with the spread of diseases and pressure on urban infrastructures as well. That's a result of migrant influxes. So these effects might dampen positive influence of rising per capita incomes. Migration might help per capita incomes, but on the broader level of development, it might actually be detrimental to development in these places. It might inhibit the demographic transition. And so I look at this, I'll go through this fairly quickly, but we operationalize international migration as a percentage of the total population, and we control for several other economic, political, and demographic explanations, both domestically and internationally. And we look at this over 1970 to 2005, which is about as far back as you can go with cross-national data at this point. And so just a couple key findings. We do find that economic development does promote human development. That's not necessarily a novel finding. We also find some interesting effects for women's status. I can talk a little bit more about that if you have questions. But the key finding is that migration has a negative effect on human development levels. So higher proportions of migrants as a percentage of the population are associated with lower scores on the Human Development Index. And this is consistent with theory, with a growing body of theory, actually, but it hasn't been shown cross-nationally. And this effect is actually robust across several different modeling techniques and after all control variables. So what are the implications? Well, migration seems to be an important determinant of human development levels. It may actually help better explain variation in development levels and or the demographic transition itself, particularly if we were able to better understand the mechanisms that actually link migration and development. That's a very key limitation of this area. What are the challenges? Well, states in less developed countries, and this is a pretty monumental task, but must try to ensure that immigration is some sort of a catalyst for rising living standards. That it doesn't just promote economic development, but that it promotes human development, a broader, more aggregate level of development. And so states should try to strengthen the association between economic and human development and emphasize human development strategies as part of overall development strategies. So in conclusion, I mean, this is sort of an initial shot in the dark type study. There isn't a lot of research on this, but I think it does tell us something very interesting and perhaps provocative about what are the consequences of immigration in the less developed world. And future research, of course, will have to go in and examine the extent to which these findings hold for particular countries at particular time points. But my purpose and our purpose has been to try to assemble this global picture of what migration looks like and the effects of migration in the developing world. So thank you very much.
Since our speakers have been very cooperative at the time and have been speaking quite fast also, we will be able to take questions after our final speaker, Ming Wen from the University of Utah, who will present her work co-authored with Xujin Wang from Fudan University in China on personal, social, and ecological factors of loneliness and satisfaction, life satisfaction among rural urban migrants in Shanghai, China.
Okay, so today I'm going to talk about migrant mental health in China, specifically in Shanghai. So let me first acknowledge my co-author, Xujin Wang. He is the director of this Institute of Demographic Research. He's a principal investigator of the data we're going to talk about today. And Fudan University is located in Shanghai. So before I talk about our specific study today, let me first talk about very briefly some general background of this research. First of all, let me talk about rural to urban migration in China. There has been rapidly growing size of rural to urban migrant population in nearly all large Chinese cities. So let me first share with you some statistics. So the Chinese governmental statistics show that there are approximately 114 million rural to urban migrants in China, accounting for 23% of total rural labor and 9% of the total population in China. And nationwide, 13% of all rural families have at least one family member who migrated to urban areas. Since we're talking about Shanghai today, so the number for Shanghai is that in Shanghai, 25% of the total population in Shanghai, or nearly 4 million, can be designated as migrant, rural to urban migrants. So this is obviously a very large phenomena. It's also considered as unprecedented population movement in Chinese history. So here are some factors that are very important to have contributed to this trend. First of all, it's growingly relaxed governmental control. So in China, there is a household registration system. In Chinese, we call it hukou. And it was established short after 1949 when the Communist Party took power. So the main purpose of this housing registration system was to basically limit population spatial movement within China. And if you are born and raised in rural areas, you are given a rural hukou, which means you cannot freely move to urban areas. And this was particularly true like 20 years or so ago. So now you can move to urban areas, but because of this very strict housing registration system, these people are largely temporary. So they can still not permanently settled in urban areas. They're considered temporary and largely driven by economic opportunities in urban areas, and they are voluntary. Okay, but in recent years, government has relaxed some control over this population movement. And there has been an increased rural to urban income inequality. Rural to urban income inequality has always been very, very large in China. But in recent years, the situation has even worsened. And there has been a certain percentage of rural labor surplus because of increased productivity and also because China has entered the World Trade Organization in 2002. And simultaneously, there has been an increase of labor needs of urban industries and communities. So what is the general image of rural to urban migrants to people who are born and raised in urban areas? So largely, it is widely accepted that people need migrant labor. Urban populations are really enjoying their cheap and diligent service. But that's not the whole picture. Also, urban people think these rural migrants are fundamentally secondary citizens. They're not just temporary, but also secondary. This is a general perception among urban populations. The situation has been getting better, but it is still very true even now. And also, you can even easily see a lot of statistics from the mass media outlets saying that, for example, the majority of crime rates in Beijing, in Shanghai, in Nanjing are basically because of migrant crime. So that's one statistic easily found in a lot of newspapers and even TV shows. And also the image about rural migrant workers is that these people are poor, highly deprived, so we need to be careful, and they are not that trustworthy. And very few urban people are truly interested in making friends with them. So they are using them, on the face value, they can treat them, nicely or politely, but deep inside, they're not really interested in talking to them, about personal things. And they know, the migrant workers, they know. From very few qualitative research, we can see the evidence there. Okay, so that's the general context of rural to urban migration in China. So here are some considerations that motivated our research. First of all, there has been very little attention paid to the health status and behavior of these migrants. There are a lot of papers written for migrants, but the majority of them are about their social stratification experiences, economic gains, their economic consequences on the local communities. And there are some papers written for health-related issues for migrants, but they're largely focused on STDs, HIVs. And from limited evidence, we can see that they're facing disproportionately higher risks for poor health due to various reasons. Although these people are very young, the average age of migrants can be below 30. It really depends on which area we're talking about, but they're generally very young people. So they can get by even if they have small health problems. They don't see doctors. All the healthcare costs are not covered. They have to pay out of their own pocket. So they tend not to see doctors. They tend to do self-care. But in the future, they may have to suffer a lot of health problems when they're still relatively young. So the future disease burden, it is forecasted or estimated by some scholars that the future disease burden associated with current migration processes would considerably slow down the development processes in China, because everybody is so interested and also fascinated with developmental development in China. And a lot of people, they haven't paid a lot of attention to mental health or health issues for this population. And we're arguing that this is going to be a huge problem in the future. And also, another motivation here is that we can test whether theories and findings in mental health and migration based on Western cultures and contexts can be generalized to other societies and here to China. Okay, quickly, previous research. I did a thorough search of electronic databases, and I found 2 studies published in English journals. The first one was a small-scale survey research published in 1998, conducted in Shenzhen, Guangdong. This is a city very close to Hong Kong. And it reported that migrant workers had poorer mental health status, and they used a symptom checklist basically developed from Western literature, then had their non-migrant counterparts and general population in China, suggesting that the mental health problems might be a big problem in this population. And the second study was conducted by Li and his colleagues, published in 2006. It was a qualitative study on migrant workers' mental health in Beijing. They reported that psychological symptoms such as hostility, social isolation, poor social adjustment, substance abuse, and sleep disorder were common among their subjects. Actually, in their research, they also found there was a lot of concerns about social relationships with the local community, with people in Beijing. They feel lonely. This is from qualitative research. I'm sure there are publications in Chinese. Just so far, my collaborator has not sent me anything there. I kept asking him, could you give me something? He said, there's very little. But I'm sure eventually, and I'm going there in May, hopefully I can find more published in Chinese. Okay, so our study, the key purpose here is to explore the patterns of loneliness and satisfaction among rural to urban migrants in Shanghai, and most importantly, to examine personal, social, and ecological influences on the 2 mental health outcomes. And the data used in this study was from the Shanghai Rural to Urban Migrant Worker Survey conducted by the Institute of Demographic Research, Fudan University. So this survey was conducted not for the purpose of examining health-related issues. It's just the one, I met my collaborator in Hong Kong last year when we were attending a geography conference. Then both of us were just coincidentally skipping that session, and then we started talking and having coffee. Eventually, he told me I had this survey. And that was the beginning of my interest, personal interest in migrant health in China. Okay, so we have 2 dependent variables. Loneliness, do you feel lonely while you are living in Shanghai? Because this survey was not conducted for the health purposes, so we have very limited measures of health. This is a 1-item question there. For satisfaction, we have 3 survey items, basically where we're asking about whether they were satisfied with income and work environment, and also a living environment. And I'm going to skip all of these independent variables We have demographic variables, social economic status variables, social capital variables, psychological factors, and discrimination. The rationale of selecting all of these factors into our study is basically from this stress and social support framework they've developed from Western literature, saying, some factors are obviously stressors and they may be positively correlated with mental health problems, and some factors like social capital factors, they serve as social resources that can buffer the negative effect of social stress. All right, so we fit a series of sequential ordinal logic models for both dependent variables. And here I'm going to just present the final results of the last model, Model 7. Factors of loneliness. Men are less lonely than women, and having no children are comparable to having children, but they were not living in Shanghai. And this is something unique for Chinese situation. A lot of people, a lot of migrants, they're married, they have children, but their spouses and children are not living with them in urban areas because they just can't afford that. And sometimes their spouses are working somewhere else in urban areas too. And as you can see here, that living arrangement with children and with spouses really matter for their mental health. Okay, so the work environment and living environment improved. Both are socioeconomic status factors, and they're consistent with our expectations. So better work environment, better living environment are associated with lower level of loneliness. And Shanghainese were helpful. Level of felt attachment to Shanghai and experienced discrimination. Those are psychological factors found to be also very important for loneliness, and particularly for experienced discrimination, and the effect is very significant. So if you feel like you have been discriminated, either in private or in public, then your risk for reporting higher levels of loneliness will be like a lot higher, significantly higher. That's also very true for satisfaction. So, but it's interesting that men, as you can see here, men are less likely than women to feel lonely. And men are also less likely than women to feel satisfied. And I don't want to comment on that, but that's interesting. So married, but spouse was not in Shanghai. This is what I just mentioned. This is also interesting, but not consistent with our expectation. So if people have spouses living with them in Shanghai, they are less likely to feel satisfied. So if you are married and your spouse are not living with you, you're more likely to be satisfied. And one reason for that, I can speculate a little bit, is that if you don't have your spouse there, even if you live in a highly deprived dorm-like situation, you'll be fine because your spouse is not with you. So in that situation, perhaps that's why you see this kind of abnormal finding there. Okay, I have 2 minutes left. So from this slide, I also want to mention this neighborhood amenity. A neighborhood amenity is captured by a series of questions asking, do you have a theater, a gym, that kind of thing. And it wasn't important for loneliness. So see, neighborhood amenity wasn't here, but it was significantly associated with satisfaction. So if you live in a neighborhood, more resourceful neighborhood, then you are more likely to be satisfied, but it doesn't help you with your loneliness. So there are a lot of policy implications that I can speculate here. And another thing I want to point out here is that male and living environment improvement interaction. So it seems like living environment improvement is good. It's good for your mental health, and it is particularly good for men and compared to women. Okay? All right, so now my time is up. I just want to show you one more thing here. That in terms of pattern, loneliness and dissatisfaction were not that uncommon. It was actually pretty common in this sample. So 21% people said they felt very lonely. 67% people said they felt somewhat lonely. Only 12% of them said they didn't feel lonely. And 16% of them felt very dissatisfied with all 3 dimensions of satisfaction questions. And 17% said they felt dissatisfied with some dimensions of work, living and pay. And only 15% said we were fully satisfied there. Okay, I'll end here. Thank you. Thank you.
So I
want to thank all the presenters for sharing their work with us, and I think we have about 10 minutes for questions that I will try to facilitate, that you may direct to the presenters who are, I think, spread sort of around the room. Yes, right here.
Does human development sort of capture, is it captured by the Human Development Index? Is it synonymous with human development?
Yes.
Yes. And so empirically we have to say that there is some association between those two concepts. Now, the second question is actually what crux of the paper itself. And I couldn't go into a lot of other subsequent analyses, but I have done analyses that show that international migration is positively associated with fertility rates over time. So higher levels of migrants are positively lead to higher levels of fertility rate across the society itself. There's a lot of paths to which that can occur, but that's one of the findings. The second finding is international migration is also associated with higher levels of infant mortality in the society as well. So there are those are two ways in which migration can indirectly affect human development levels, higher levels of fertility, higher levels of infant mortality across the society itself. Those are widely known to be limiting factors for human development. Yeah.
But embedded in that is a very, very tenuous and dangerous assumption that the person coming from that sending country has embedded in him human capability, which is a component of human development. Is that not correct?
That's correct. And so there are positive, there are positive outcomes of international migration. I tended to dwell on the negative outcomes. The most positive one being that it seems to promote economic development. And the human capital that immigrants have inherent in them does seem to benefit economic development levels, per capita income levels. The problem is it doesn't seem to translate into improvements in human development. And there's slippage. And that's the rub that this sort of reveals.
Hey, just a follow-up question. And the question is, I'm sorry if I missed it. It was a very wonderful series of presentations. But how many countries did you include in your sample?
There are 24 countries, but 66 observations.
And those countries are from the less developed world?
Yes.
Is that? So I'm wondering two things. One of them has to do with the short-term effects of that kind of migration. You did not include refugees, I presume, or did you?
No, this is international
Yeah.
migration.
So the question is, I think it's very important, and you are right on the mark, that we should not just assume that migration of any kind has positive effects on areas of destination. And it's kind of courageous because, of course, that opens up the field to all kinds of risks. Which we don't, it's like doing research on genetic endowment and everybody starts kind of like hyperventilating, right? But if we are honest researchers, we must not shy away from that kind of investigation because that's the business that we're in. I mean, otherwise we can become media pundits, right? So in that respect, I'm very, very interested in that study. I just, very quickly, two things. One, a differentiation between the short-term and the long-term effects. And that also applies to fertility rates because, for example, it looks, although I really haven't looked closely at the research, that Mexican immigrants in the United States have higher fertility rates than in country of origin. But the question is, we don't know exactly why. I can speculate, but it's hard to imagine that that's going to be a long-term trend. So my recommendation would be to really look at short-term and long-term effects.
Another question. I have a question for the Cheney and Ortiz and
Agyeman-Budu paper. I'm wondering about, you talked about corporate accountability or responsibility. I'm thinking about the issue of subcontracting commodity chains and how this is a very complex process, the way that things are produced and then marketed globally. And if any of some of the legislation or treaties that have been passed have addressed the issue of commodity chains and responsibilities of TNCs in policing or addressing the work of subcontractors, where I think a lot of the abuse would potentially be occurring.
Thank you. That's a really good question. And like all the other speakers, all the other papers, we couldn't go into as much detail here as we do in the paper. But I mean, if you follow, and this follows up on some points that Tony was making this morning, and also Cecilia, and that is, look at the history of the development of corporations, okay, and the ironies associated with that in terms of the relationship between the corporation and the state. But in recent years, I mean, just as you point out, the subcontracting that goes on, the offshoring that goes on, the partnerships that are formed and so forth, greatly complicate the question of agency. And so even if you assume a kind of responsibility, either informal or actually encoded in law, I mean, the whole question of what do you do with that is very, very important. And we argue in the paper that needs to be dealt with in order to have accountability today be meaningful. But we just can't keep dancing around it. And it's not as if we've sorted out agency questions for corporations with simple boundaries either. We haven't done that. I mean, we gave corporations personhood in 1886 in the United States and then in other countries. And since that time, corporations have accrued rights, but not nearly as many responsibilities. So we're arguing for addressing that and using, I mean, ultimately we would like to see major institutional change. Okay, as was mentioned by a couple of speakers this morning. Short of that, though, we would take things like the Global Compact and give it both more depth and more teeth to deal with some of those issues. You're absolutely right. I mean, it's kind of, if I could mention very briefly, there was an article in Business Week, not exactly a radical publication, right, in 1991 where they said, oh my, corporations no longer respect national boundaries. What are we going to do? So, I mean, with respect to that whole issue of sovereignty as well as agency, corporations assume a kind of sovereignty, and they have it informally and in some quasi-formal ways. And we really have to get our arms around that. Otherwise, we're not dealing with a giant piece of not just migration issues, but human rights in general.
Thank you. I think we can take one or two more questions.
This is for Matt. I'm a little perplexed at what this study of the Human Development Index, relating it to international migration, is looking at. It's a 24-country cross-sectional regression, right? Now, international I looked at the list of the countries, 24 countries, and that's good. I've seen many studies of this kind where they would have 20 or 30 developing countries, and they'd put in Israel or some country which is clearly not a developing country like the rest, and they'd have a nice little regression line that runs through one cluster where there's no relationship and one outlying point. So you didn't do that, although I still wonder how sensitive it is to, for example, Argentina or Bulgaria, which are a little quite different from Vietnam and Ghana and so on. But the real issue is this migration. Most of these are countries of emigration. There's only a few of them that are net immigration countries. Argentina, I noticed. So your variable, I'm not sure what the migration variable is measuring. You said it's immigrants as a percent, or so it's the stock of immigrants at a certain time as a percent of the population. So you're not looking at the dynamic process of migrants coming in or out, which is the more interesting question. And that's where people get into looking at the impact of remittances, for example. And people who do those studies should be looking at remittances and migration flows both, and return migration. That's really getting more at the heart of the issue. So you've got the stock of immigrants and sort of depleting the Human Development Index. Is that's what it's? Yeah. So these are where are these? The question is, where are these immigrants coming from? Now, if in Argentina, I know that they're coming mostly from neighboring countries where the Human Development Index is lower, such as Paraguay and Bolivia. So that would lower it without having any causal relationship. Anyway, it's a complicated subject. And
it's very complex. So we can't tease out at this level of aggregation, of course, where people are coming from. But our question is different, and that is our question is different, and that is the probably the highest level of abstraction possible. What is the relationship between international migration and human development, economic development, fertility, and mortality, things that our demographers have always been fairly interested in, but have not necessarily put together a global picture. Now, that's not to say that country studies, case studies, even studies at a subnational level aren't important at all. That's actually that's the logical next step from this sort of an analysis. This is certainly not the last word, but I hope it raises questions at a national or even a subnational level about what are the very same questions you're asking about. What are the implications of these sorts of flows? And we can be more detailed about it. Does it matter if Uruguayans are moving into Argentina? Is that a different effect from Paraguayans moving into Argentina? Those are separate questions, and they're very valuable questions. I can't answer those at this level of aggregation. It's just a different question. But you're right about, I mean, that's the next step, right? That would be the logical next step of it.
I think we'll take one more question.
My question is for the panel, anyone in general, especially Erin. I enjoyed your paper. How do the major points that you have presented relate to patterns of global terrorism? Thank you.
Do you want to take this?
Wait,
I'm not sure it's illuminating. That's a different. I'm going to speak as a psychologist because that's just what I know. But certainly something that makes people. I mean, the overwhelming evidence about people who become terrorists is that they aren't crazy, wacky people. They're normal people who have a very committed ideology and a willingness to put everything on the line in ways that endanger the rest of us. And I think dynamics that leave people feeling excluded are a dangerous piece of that puzzle, but they're certainly not the only piece. So that, I mean, that's as much as I can say about that.
I have not done first-hand research on that, but to the extent that I can tell, one very interesting thing to be taken into consideration is that it tends to be a second, third, and fourth generation phenomenon.
Right.
So it's not first-generation immigrants who, however you want to define terrorism, which I personally feel is one of those terms that requires definitional refinement, because it's difficult to deal, and I don't encourage my students to use the term because it leads you into strange places. But I think she's right in that it's not a problem. Somebody mentioned it earlier today, that impoverishment may be a necessary but not a sufficient condition. And in fact, I think that most research suggests that people who engage in those kinds of activities are not people who are desperately poor. So, you know, forget about the correlation between immiseration and so-called terrorism. Other phenomena are going on here. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world, and that includes American prisons. It is about exclusion rather than poverty. It is predominantly masculine, so it suggests a lot of issues that have to do with gender, and is motivated by local resentments, which then connect into a more global kind of ideology. I do like the work of Salman Rushdie, and may I encourage everybody to read Shalimar the Clown, which is a strangely sympathetic portrayal of the creation of an assassin. So what happens is that there are all these resentments at local levels that are then unified by geniuses like Osama bin Laden. And then there is the internet. Do you think?
Okay.
Because it is very much an internet phenomenon. I mean, the internet has connected a lot of people out there who have local resentments, but who are now justifying them or explaining them in terms of a global ideology. It's a fascinating subject.
Thank you very much. And actually, that last question and the discussion that ensued is a wonderful segue into the beginning of tomorrow's series of discussions, because our first panel tomorrow will be on security issues as related to migration. So let me make three quick announcements. One is we will reconvene at 8:30 sharp tomorrow morning with a brief recap and an opportunity for a bit of discussion. And that security panel will begin at 8:45. Thank you very much. And guests here at the University of Utah, you'll be picked up at 6:20 for dinner in front of the guest house, which is, as you know, just 2 doors down. And then finally, let me remind you that the conclusion of the conference tomorrow afternoon at 4 provides an opportunity for less structured discussion with our guest scholars and other experts. So thank you very much and have a good evening.